Fairy Tale Corner of the Narratives. I'm Kasha. Tonight's tale takes us on a journey to the Catskill Mountains. It's not exactly a land far, far away, but far enough. A tale that reminds us that life waits for no one, and one must always tend to their obligations. Rip Van Winkle. Now, I gotta go remind Dad about the past.
Here we go. Oh, the magic. Whoever has made a voyage to the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a branch of the great Appalachian family and are seen to the west of the river, swelling up to the noble height and reigning over the surrounding country. At the foot of these Faerie mountains lies a little village of great age, where visitors will find some of the house of the original settlers, built of small yellow bricks, having latticed windows, gable fronts, and surmounted with weather vanes. In that same village, and in one of those very houses, there lived many years since a simple, good-natured fellow. As a matter of fact, name that man Rip Van Winkle. He was a descendant of the Van Winkles, who were held in high regard. He inherited, however, very little of his ancestors and remained a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor and an obedient, bullied husband. The children of the village, too, would shout with joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports, made playthings, taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles, and told them long stories of ghosts, witches, and Indians. And not a single dog would bark at him throughout the neighborhood. The great error in Rip's composition was a strong dislike of all kinds of profitable labor. It could not be from the want of perseverance, for he would sit on a wet rock with a rod as long as a broomstick and fish all day without a murmur, even though he would not be encouraged by a single nibble. In a word, Rip was ready to attend to anybody's business, but never to his own. Attending to his own family and family duties he found simply impossible. His children, too, were ragged and wild as if they belonged to nobody. His son, Rip, promised to inherit all that belonged to his father, was generally seen trudging around like a young horse at his mother's heels, in a pair of his father's old trousers which he had to hold up with one hand. Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of the happiest and most foolish of men. If left to himself, he would have whistled his life away in perfect contentment. But that would never happen, with his wife continually nagging in his ear about his lazy carelessness and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Rip had but one way of replying to all lectures of the kind, and that by frequent use had grown into habit. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, cast his eyes, but said nothing. This, however, always provoked a fresh hailstorm from his wife that forced him to take the outside of the house, the only side which, in truth, belongs to a hen-pecked husband. Rip's sole support was his dog Wolf, who was bullied as his master. For Dame Van Winkle regarded them as lazy companions, even looked upon Wolf with an evil eye, and blamed him for her husband's lazy nature. True it is that Wolf was as courageous an animal as ever scoured the woods, but when Wolf entered the house, he cowered his head, his tail drooped to the ground, and he sneaked about the house while casting many a sidelong glance at Dame Van Winkle. And at the slightest wave of a broomstick, he would fly to the door with yelping haste. Times grew worse and worse for Rip Van Winkle as the years of matrimony rolled on. For a long while he used to console himself by frequenting a kind of everlasting group of wise men, philosophers, and other idle people of the village. Here they would sit in the shade of a long, lazy summer's day, talking listlessly over village gossip or telling endless stories about nothing. One day an old newspaper fell into their hands from a passing traveler, and the men listened intently to the contents as spoken by Derek Van Bummel. They would spend countless hours deliberating the contents, led by none other than Nicholas Vedder. Nicholas was a patriarch of the village and the landlord of the inn, who took his seat just near the door of the inn, moving only to stay out of the sun. It is true he rarely spoke, but smoked his pipe incessantly. However, those that knew him perfectly understood him. From even this stronghold, the unlucky Rip was at length overpowered by his harsh-tempered wife, who would suddenly break in upon the assemblage and call the members all to naught. Poor Rip was last reduced to almost despair, and his only alternative to escape from the labor of the farm and his bullying wife was to take the gun in hand and stroll into the woods. Here he would sometimes seat himself at the foot of a tree and share the contents of his wallet with Wolf, with whom he sympathized as a fellow sufferer of ill treatment. On a fine autumn day, Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskill Mountains. He was after his favorite sport of squirrel shooting, and the silence echoed and echoed with the reports of his gun. Panting and fatigued, he threw himself late in the afternoon on a green knoll near the edge of a cliff. Evening was gradually advancing. The mountain began to throw their long blue shadows over the valleys. He saw that it would be dark long before he could reach the village, and he heaved a heavy sigh. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance calling out, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" He looked round, but could see nothing but a crow flying high across the mountain. He thought his own desires must have deceived him, and turned again to descend when he heard the same cry ring through the still evening air. "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" He looked anxiously at the same direction and saw a strange figure slowly coming up the rocks and bending under the weight of something he carried on his back. He was surprised to see but anyone in a lonely place, but knowing he was in need of assistance, he hastened down to yield it. As he grew closer, he was surprised at the man's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow with a thick, bushy hair and a grizzly beard. He bore on his shoulder with a stout keg that seemed full of liquor, and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. Though rather shy and distrustful of his new acquaintance, Rip complied, and together they climbed up a narrow gully. As they ascended, Rip every now and then heard a long rolling peals of distant thunder that gave him pause, but he continued on his path with his new companion towards a deep ravine, as there was something strange about the unknown that inspired awe in him. Passing through the ravine, they came to a hollow, like a small amphitheater surrounded by cliffs. On entering the amphitheater, new objects of wonder presented themselves. In the center was a company of odd-looking people playing a game of mind pins. They were dressed in quaint, outlandish fashion. Some wore jackets with long knives in their belts, and most of them had enormous trousers of similar style with that of the guides. They also looked peculiar. One had a large head, broad face, and small piggish eyes. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of a nose, and wore a white sugarloaf hat set off with a little red cock's tail. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman with a weather-beaten countenance. He wore a lace doublet, broad belt with hanging, high-crowned hat and feather, red stockings, and high-heeled shoes with roses in them. As Rip and his companion approached them, they suddenly desisted from their play and stared at him with such fixed, statue-like gaze that his heart turned within him and his knees grew together. His companion now emptied the contents of the keg into large flagons and made signs to him to wait upon the company. He obeyed with fear and trembling. They drank their liquor in silence and then returned to their game. As time went on, Rip's fear subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage. He was naturally a thirsty soul and was soon tempted to repeat that drought. One taste provoked another and another until he fell into a deep sleep. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was bright sunny morning. The birds were chirping and a cool mountain breeze could be felt through the trees. Surely though, Rip, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep. The strange man with the keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the party of mine pens, the flagon. Oh, that flagon, that wicked flagon! Thought Rip, what excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle? He now suspected that the grave revelers of the mountain had put a trick upon him, and having doused him with liquor, had robbed him of his gun. Wolf, too, had disappeared with everyone. He determined to revisit the scene of last evening's gamble, and if he met with any of the party to demand his dog and gun, as he rose to walk, he found himself stiff in the joints and wanting his usual activity. Rip finally reached the ravine which had opened the cliffs of the amphitheater, but no traces of such opening remained. Poor Rip was brought to a stand. He again called and whistled after his dog. He was only answering by the cawing of a flock of idle crows. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip felt famished for the want of his breakfast. He grieved to give up his dog and gun. He dreaded to meet his wife, but it would be of no good to starve among the mountains. So he took his head and he headed home. The very village was altered. It was larger and more populous. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been his familiar haunts had disappeared. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. Surely this was his native village, which he had left but the day before. There stood the Catskill Mountains. There ran the Silver Hudson at the distance. There was every hill and dale precisely as it had always been. Rip was sorely perplexed. It was with some difficulty that he found his way to his own house, which he approached with silent awe, expecting every moment to hear the shrill voice of Dame Van Winkle. He found the house gone to decay, the roof fallen in, the windows shattered, and the doors off the hinges. A half-starved dog that looked like Wolf was sulking about. Rip called him by name, but the dog snarled, showed his teeth, and passed on. This was an unkind dog indeed. My very dog, sighed Rip, has forgotten me. He entered the house. It was empty and abandoned. He called loudly for his wife and children. The lonely chambers rang for a moment with his voice, and then all again was silence. He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn, but it too was gone. A large wooden building stood in its place, and over the door was painted the Union Hotel by Jonathan Doolittle. There was, as usual, a crowd of folk about the door, but none that Rip recollected. The very character of people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling tone about it, instead of the accustomed drowsy tranquility. He looked in vain for the wise men he knew well, but found none. The appearance of Rip with his long, grizzled beard, his rusty hunting piece, his uncouth dress, an army of women and children at his heels, soon attracted the attention of the tavern politicians. They crowded round him, eyeing him from head to foot with great curiosity. The orator bustled up to him and, drawing him partly aside, inquired on which side he voted. Rip stared in a vacant stupidity. Another short but busy little fellow pulled him by the arm and, rising on tiptoe, inquired in his ear whether he was a Federal or Democrat. Rip was equally at a loss to comprehend the question, when a knowing, self-important old gentleman in a strong cocked hat made his way through the crowd, his keen eyes sharp, hat penetrating as it were into his very soul, demanded in an austere tone what brought him to the election with a gun on his shoulder and a mob at his heels, and whether he meant to breed a riot in the village. Alas, gentlemen, cried Rip, somewhat dismayed, I am a poor quiet man, a native of the place and a loyal subject to the king. God bless him." Here a general shout burst from the bystanders. "A Tor, a spy, a refugee, hustle them, away with them!" It was with great difficulty that the self-important man in the cocked hat restored order, and having assumed a tenfold austerity of brow, demanded again of the unknown culprit what he came there for and whom he was seeking. The poor man humbly assured him that he was meant no harm, but merely came there in search of some of his neighbors. "Well, who are they? Name them." Rip bethought himself a moment and inquired, "Where's Nicholas Vedder?" There was a silence for a little while, when an old man replied in a thin, piping voice, "Nicholas Vedder? Why, he's dead and gone these 18 years. His tombstone lie in the churchyard." "Where's Van Brummel, the schoolmaster?" "He went off to the wars too, was a great militia general, now in Congress." Rip's heart died away at hearing of these sad changes in his home, and his friends finding themselves thus alone in the world. Every answer puzzled him. He had no courage to ask after any more friends, but cried out in despair, "Does anyone here know Rip Van Winkle?" "Oh, Rip Van Winkle!" exclaimed two or three. Oh, to be sure, that's Rip Van yonder, leaning against the tree." Rip looked and beheld a precise counterpart of himself as he went up the mountain, apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged. The poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity and whether he himself was another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, the man in the cocked hat demanded who he was and what was his name. "God knows," exclaimed he at his wit's end. "I'm not myself. I'm somebody else. That's me yonder. No, that's somebody else that got my shoes. I was myself last night, but I fell asleep on the mountain, and they changed my gun. Everything's changed, and I'm changed. I can't tell what's my name or who I am." The bystanders began to now look at each other, nod, wink significantly, and tap their fingers against their foreheads. There was a whisper also about securing the gun and keeping the old fellow from doing mischief. At this critical moment, a fresh, comely woman pressed through the throng to get a peep at the gray-bearded man. She had a chubby child in her arms, which, frightened at his looks, began to cry. "Hush, Rip," cried she. "Hush, you little fool. The old man won't hurt you." The name of the child, the air of the mother, the tone of her voice, all awakened a train of recollections in his mind. "What's your name, my good woman?" asked he. "Judith Garnier." "And your father's name?" "Ah, poor man, Rip Van Winkle was the name, but it's 20 years since he went away from home with his gun and never has been heard of since. His dog came home without him, but whether he shot himself or was carried away by the Indians, nobody can tell. I was then but a little girl." Rip had but one question more to ask, but he put it with a faltering voice. "Where's your mother?" "Oh, she too had died but a short time since. She broke a blood vessel in a fit of passion at a New England peddler." There was a drop of comfort, at least in this intelligence. The honest man could contain himself no longer. He caught his daughter and her child in his arms. "I'm your father," cried he. "Young Rip Van Winkle once, old Rip Van Winkle now. Does nobody know poor Rip Van Winkle?" All stood amazed until an old woman, tottering out from among the crowd, put her hand to her face brow, and peering under it in his face for a moment, exclaimed, "Sure enough, it is Rip Van Winkle. It is Rip Van Winkle himself. Welcome home again, old neighbor. Why, where have you been these last long 20 years?" Rip's story was soon told, for the whole 20 years had been to him but as one night. The neighbors stared when they heard it. Some were seen to wink at each other and put their tongues in their cheeks, but knowing well that the Catskill had always been haunted by a great Hendrick Hudson, the first discoverer of the river and country, they began to believe him. For it was well known that Hudson kept a kind of vigil there every 20 years. With his crew of the Half Moon being permitted in the way to revisit the scenes of his enterprise, and keep a guardian eye upon the river and the great city called by his name. To make a long story short, the company broke up and returned to the more important concerns of the election. Rip's daughter took him home to live with her. She had a snug, well-furnished house and a stout, cheery farmer for a husband, whom Rip recollected for one of his urchins that used to climb upon his back. As to Rip's son and heir, who was the ditto of himself seen leaning against the tree, he was employed to work on the farm, but like his father, didn't want to tend too much but his own business. Rip now resumed his old walks and habits. He soon found many of his former cronies, though all rather the worse for the wear and tear of time, and preferred making friends among the rising generation, with whom he soon grew into great favor with his tales of old times. And whenever anyone mentioned the name of Dame Van Winkle, Rip shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, and cast his eyes, which might pass either for an expression of accepting his fate or joy at his freedom. The end. Thank you for joining us in Fairy Tale Corner.